In the winter of 1821, the air in the small English village of Morthwaite carried with it a silence that seemed too heavy for its size. The streets were narrow, their stones worn smooth by carts and boots, the cottages hunched together as though shielding themselves from the endless damp cold. Smoke rose from chimneys and drifted across the rooftops, a sign of life clinging stubbornly to the edge of comfort. The people of the village went about their days in a rhythm as predictable as the toll of the church bell. Men worked the fields or tended to livestock. Women kept the hearth warm and children close, and the church remained the one place where everyone gathered under the same roof, united by faith and gossip in equal measure. To an outsider, it might have seemed an ordinary place, untouched by the turmoil of the wider world. But something dark had already taken root there, a shadow that would soon grow impossible to ignore. Among the rows of cottages stood one that looked like all the rest, though within its walls lived a boy who was anything but ordinary. He was thin, pale, with eyes too large for his face, eyes that seemed always to be searching for something no one else could see. His family was modest, living with just enough to scrape by. His father, a quiet man with calloused hands, was known for his temper, which flickered like a candle flame, small until the wind caught it. His mother worked tirelessly, her body frail from endless chores and childbirth, her voice soft but threaded with worry. To neighbors, they seemed no different from any other household, but behind their door, tension grew like rot beneath floorboards, silent, unseen, until it finally broke through. The boy was not known for mischief, nor was he particularly gifted in work or play. What set him apart was something no one could explain, a voice that sometimes spoke in sounds not heard in him. At first, his parents dismissed it as babbling, the nonsense of a child whose imagination wandered too far. But as he grew, the words sharpened, gained weight, and sometimes filled the small cottage until even the fire seemed to shrink back in its place. His mother tried to hush him, fearful of gossip, while his father grew angry, demanding silence. Yet the boy could not seem to help it. The language slipped from him in the quiet hours of dawn or the stillness of night, and when he spoke it, his eyes appeared distant, as though he were listening to someone, or something, that only he could hear. The villagers began to notice. Children whispered that he was cursed, that his tongue belonged to spirits, not to God. Mothers pulled their little ones closer when he walked by, though they smiled politely at his family. The priest grew restless, sensing something unholy, though he dared not speak of it too loudly. In a village where faith governed nearly every thought, there was little room for something that defied explanation. Still, whispers spread. They always do. And whispers can turn a family into outsiders faster than poverty or illness ever could. Yet life went on, at least on the surface. The fields demanded tending, and winter demanded wood for the fire. People nodded to one another in passing, careful not to stare too long at the boy who sometimes muttered under his breath words that twisted like smoke. His family tried to hold together what normalcy they could, though unease had already seeped into their bones. There were nights when the mother lay awake, staring at the low ceiling, wondering if her son's gift or curse would bring ruin to them all. Behind the polite greetings and Sunday prayers, there were darker undercurrents. The father's temper would flare when the boy would not be silent. The mother's quiet fear was too deep to speak aloud, and the boy himself, trapped between their love and their suspicion, unsure of why his own mouth betrayed him. In the village of Morthwaite, where lives were measured by crops and seasons, where the world was meant to be predictable and safe, something strange had taken root in the form of a child. And though no one could yet name it, everyone seemed to sense that the fragile balance of their lives was about to be broken. The snow began to fall harder as the year waned, blanketing the village in white silence. Fires burned longer, candles flickered later into the night, and families huddled close indoors. But inside that one cottage, the silence was often broken by the boy's strange tongue, rising and falling like a prayer that belonged to no god the villagers knew. It would not be long before that voice, that language, would draw attention far beyond the fields of Morthwaite. a tension that would change everything. The days in Morthwaite grew shorter as the winter of 1821 deepened, and with each passing week, the boy's strange tongue became harder for his family to ignore. What had once been dismissed as childish babble now carried a weight that unsettled even the strongest men in the village. His words seemed too deliberate, too measured, as though they belonged to an ancient place far older than the stones beneath their feet. His father's patience thinned with every utterance. Where once he had scolded with a sharp word or a heavy hand, now he seethed in silence, his anger festering in the small, smoke-stained rooms of their cottage. His mother tried to shield the boy, insisting he meant no harm, but her voice shook when she said it, betraying the fear she fought to bury. The village's watchful eyes made things worse. Neighbors began to exchange wary glances, their conversations faltering whenever the boy or his mother passed by. At first, it was harmless gossip, the kind that clings to small towns where everyone knows one another's business. But soon, the whispers grew sharper. The baker's wife swore she heard the boy mutter as she passed him in the lane, words that made her hair rise on the back of her neck. The blacksmith told of a night he saw the boy staring at the church doors as though he were waiting for them to open by themselves. Mothers crossed themselves when the boy's strange syllables reached their ears. Some called it the devil's tongue. Others said it was a language of angels, though not the kind anyone prayed to. Either way, the boy became something to be feared. The priest, Father Alden, found himself at the center of the unease. He had lived through many winters and had seen sickness, famine, and grief unravel families, but this was different. The boy's language troubled him in ways he could not name. It was not Latin, nor any scripture he knew, but when the boy spoke it, Father Alden felt his stomach turn, as though the words were pulling at something hidden deep inside. He urged the family to bring the boy to church more often, hoping prayer might quiet the strange gift or curse that set him apart. But the boy resisted. On Sundays, he sat in the pews with his eyes fixed on the altar, his lips moving in silent patterns that unsettled even the devout. And when he did open his mouth, the words that slipped out were never part of the hymns. Inside the family home, tensions climbed. The father grew increasingly harsh, striking the boy when he spoke out of turn, shouting when his wife tried to defend him. He saw in his son not just a child, but a danger, something that could strip the family of what little standing they had. In the village, every time the boy's tongue betrayed him, the father imagined their name whispered in darker tones, their family branded as cursed. And in a place like Morthwaite, reputation was survival. The father's anger was not only born of fear, but of pride, the desperate need to maintain control in a world where control slipped so easily away. The mother's fear ran deeper, though quieter. She had always been the boy's shield, but she began to question what exactly she was protecting. In the long hours of the night, when her husband slept heavy and the fire had died to embers, she would hear her son whispering into the dark. She could not understand the words, yet they filled her with dread, as though the boy was speaking to someone unseen, someone sitting in the room with them. More than once she pressed her hand to her mouth to stop herself from crying out, afraid her husband would wake. Her love for her son was fierce, but it was laced with terror now, and she felt herself torn in two. The boy himself was not blind to what unfolded around him. He saw the fear in his mother's eyes, the rage in his father's clenched fists. He felt the weight of the villagers' stares, and he began to change. The once quiet, timid child grew withdrawn, speaking less in the common tongue and more in the language that rose unbidden from within him. It was as though the rejection of those around him only drew him deeper into whatever strange world had taken root in his mind. He spent hours wandering near the edge of the woods, speaking softly under his breath visible in the frosty air. Some villagers claimed they heard voices answering him, though none could say for certain. Whether truth or rumor, the effect was the same. The boy became a figure of dread. It wasn't only the villagers who watched him. Father Alden began visiting the family more often, under the pretense of offering guidance and prayer. But there was something else in his visits, curiosity, even obsession. He pressed the boy with questions, trying to draw meaning from the strange tongue. Sometimes the boy answered him, his voice low and steady, and Father Alden would leave pale and shaken. Other times, the boy refused to speak at all, staring instead with those large, searching eyes that made even a man of God feel exposed. The priest began to see the boy not as a child, but as a mystery, one he felt both compelled and repelled to solve. Outside forces pressed harder on the family as winter wore on. The harvest had been poor that year, and money was scarce. Food was rationed, and debts whispered about. Families in Morthwaite had little patience for anything, or anyone, that threatened their fragile survival. To them, the boy was not only strange, but dangerous, his very presence tempting the wrath of God at a time when they could least afford it. It was not long before subtle warnings crept into the father's ears. Men at the tavern muttered that the boy needed to be set right or sent away. Women left gaps in conversations when his mother approached. Fear was turning into something harder, something sharper. The father, already burdened by the weight of survival, began to drink more, his temper flaring hotter with each cup. Nights grew louder in the cottage, arguments spilling through thin walls, neighbors hearing the shouts but saying nothing. The boy, caught in the center, withdrew further, his eyes distant, his voice low, as though he lived in two worlds at once, the one around him and the one only he could hear. His mother's strength faltered as her husband's fists grew heavier, and though she tried to keep the boy close, even she began to wonder if perhaps the villagers were right. What no one yet knew was that the boy had begun writing. On scraps of old parchment, with bits of charcoal, he scrawled the same strange symbols that matched the sounds of his tongue. His mother found them hidden beneath his mattress one morning while cleaning. The sight froze her. The shapes were sharp and winding, nothing she had ever seen before, and yet there was a rhythm to them, as though they belonged to some system of meaning. She burned them quickly, terrified her husband might find them, but the image stayed with her long after the ashes were swept away. She wondered if her son was creating something new, or if he was remembering something unspeakably old. As weeks turned to months, the family was stretched to breaking. The father saw his authority slipping through his fingers, his wife no longer able to soothe his anger, his son refusing to obey. The mother lived in constant fear, torn between love and suspicion, praying for answers that never came. And the boy, caught between their anger, their fear, and his own strange gift, slipped deeper into the shadows of himself. The language filling him like water rising in a well. The village of Morthwaite, with its snow-blanketed lanes and smoke-stained chimneys, had always seemed steady, predictable. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Whispers had hardened into judgments. The father's pride had curdled into rage. The mother's love had curdled into dread. And at the heart of it stood a boy whose voice carried words no one could understand, words that would soon tear the fragile world of Morthwaite apart. The night it happened, the air in Morthwaite was so cold it seemed to crack with every breath. Snow pressed against the cottage windows, the wind scraping like fingernails across the wood. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing long shadows that swayed against the walls. The family had spent the day in silence, each moving around the other as if afraid to speak. The father's eyes burned with the weight of too many whispered warnings from the village. The mother's hands shook as she prepared the evening meal, her mind heavy with fear of what she had found hidden in her son's mattress just days before. New scraps of parchment covered in those curling symbols that should not exist. And the boy himself sat quietly at the table, his fingers tapping the wood in slow rhythm, his lips moving in that strange tongue that filled the room with unease. The father snapped first. He slammed his cup against the table, the sound sharp as a gunshot. His voice, thick with drink and rag. He cut through the air. He shouted for the boy to stop, to never speak those words again. But the boy, perhaps out of defiance, or perhaps because he could not control it, kept muttering. The language spilled out, smooth and steady, as if it were not his choice but something inside him demanding to be heard. His eyes were distant, glazed, as though he were staring through his father instead of at him. The mother rushed to calm the storm, her voice trembling, her hands reaching to touch her husband's arm, but it only fueled his anger. He pushed her aside and rose from his chair, his shadow stretching across the boy. In his mind, it was no longer his son sitting there, but something else, something foreign that had poisoned his home. The boy looked up at him then, his large eyes shining with a calm that seemed unnatural, and spoke a string of words so fluid, so alien, that the father's blood seemed to run cold. He roared in fury, convinced the devil himself had taken root in the child. The moment broke like glass. The father's hand seized the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth, his knuckles white around the handle. The mother screamed, her body lunging forward to stop him, but her strength was nothing against his. The boy did not move. He did not cry out. He only spoke faster, his voice rising, the strange words filling the air like a chant. It was as though he had surrendered himself to whatever force spoke through him. The father, blinded by fear and rage, raised the poker high. The sound of it crashing down split the room as sharply as thunder. The mother's screams filled the small cottage. She threw herself over her son, but it was too late. Blood darkened the wooden floor, pooling where the boy lay still. The strange language that had spilled from his lips only moments before stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the mother's sobs. The father staggered back, the poker clattering from his hands. His chest heaved, his eyes wild, as the enormity of what he had done bore down on him. For a moment, no one moved. The fire crackled, the snow pressed against the windows, and the boy lay motionless in his mother's arms. She rocked him, her tears falling hot onto his pale face, her voice broken as she whispered his name again and again, as though saying it enough might bring him back. The father pressed his hands to his head, pacing in small, frantic steps, muttering to himself that he had no choice, that the boy had been cursed, that it saved them all from ruin. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. The mother lifted her face to him, her eyes blazing through her grief. She screamed at him, not in fear, but in fury. She called him a murderer, cursed him with every word her trembling voice could find. She swore he had killed not only their son, but something pure, something innocent. The father flinched at her words as though they were blows, but his anger quickly returned. He shouted back, insisting the boy had been lost long ago, insisting he had done what any man would do to protect his family and his name. But inside, a seed of doubt gnawed at him, sharper than any accusation his wife could throw. The crime left its mark on the cottage almost immediately. The mother refused to let the boy's body go, clutching him to her chest until her arms ached, refusing to hear the father's demands to bury him before the village found out. She wanted the world to know what had been done. The father, frantic with fear, paced the room, his mind racing with ways to hide the truth. He saw the villagers' stares, their whispers turning into open condemnation. He saw the priest demanding answers. He saw himself branded not as a man protecting his family, but as a monster. In his desperation, he tried to reason with her. He begged her to understand, to see that it had been necessary. But she would not listen. Her grief was too great, her anger too deep. In her heart, she no longer saw him as her husband, but as the man who had taken everything from her. She clung to the boy's body as though it were the last barrier between herself and the abyss. The father's panic grew. His thoughts turned dark, circling around the idea of burying the boy in the woods, of telling the villagers he had wandered off into the snow. Anything to erase what had happened within those four walls. But the truth hung heavy in the air, impossible to smother. The boy's silence, the blood on the floor, the way the mother's screams carried into the night, all of it bound them to the act in a way that could not be undone. As the hours dragged on, the father sat slumped by the fire, his face buried in his hands. The mother wept until her voice broke, cradling her son until exhaustion overcame her. The cottage was no longer a home, but a tomb, every corner steeped in what had been lost. And though the snow still fell outside, covering the village in a clean white silence, Inside the walls of that cottage there was only blood, grief, and the haunting knowledge that a crime had been committed that could never be hidden, never forgiven, never forgotten. Morning came slowly, as though even the sun was reluctant to shine on what had taken place inside the cottage. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind only faint trails of smoke and the bitter smell of ash. The boy lay still where his mother cradled him, her arms stiff with exhaustion, her body heavy with grief. She had not slept. Her eyes were hollow, her lips cracked from whispering prayers through the night. Across the room, her husband sat slumped in a chair, his head buried in his hands, the iron poker still stained where it had fallen. The silence between them was unbearable, broken only by the mother's occasional sobs that seemed to echo against the wooden walls. The father spoke first. His voice was low, ragged, as though the words scraped his throat. He said they had to move quickly, that no one could know what had happened. He insisted the boy's body be buried before the village awoke, before gossip and suspicion spread. But the mother refused. She clung tighter to her son, her face twisted with both sorrow and fury. She told him he could cover his guilt with earth, but he could never bury what he had done. For the first time in their marriage, her voice did not tremble before his anger. It rose against it, sharp and unyielding. That be why mid-morning, the village began to stir. Smoke rose again from chimneys, and the church bell tolled. As it always did. But something was different in Morthwaite. Neighbors had heard the screams in the night, muffled but unmistakable, cutting through the storm. The baker's wife told her husband that something was terribly wrong in that cottage. Children whispered of shadows moving past the windows. Father Alden, guided by his growing unease and a sense of duty, made his way up the narrow path toward the family's home. When he entered, the sight that met him froze him in place. The boy's body lay in his mother's lap, wrapped in a tattered blanket, his small face pale against her tear-streaked cheeks. The father stood stiff, his eyes wild with a mixture of defiance and dread. The priest's breath caught. For a moment, he said nothing, only stared, the weight of Scripture and sin pressing hard on his chest. Then, in a voice that trembled, he asked what had happened. The mother answered first, her voice cracking but steady enough to cut through the room. She said her husband had killed their son, beaten him in anger and fear. She did not soften the truth. She spoke it as though it were her duty, a final act of justice for the child she could not save. The father erupted, shouting over her, insisting he had rid the house of evil, insisting the boy had not been their son anymore, but a vessel for something darker. His words tumbled out in a frenzy, half plea, half accusation, his eyes searching the priest's face for some sign of agreement. But Father Alden's face only darkened. He did not see a man protecting his home, but a father who had lost himself to fear and violence. He commanded the father to be still and dropped to his knees beside the mother, whispering prayers over the lifeless boy. The mother sobbed as she listened, clutching her son tighter, while the father paced the floor like a trapped animal, his mind unraveling with each passing moment. Word spread quickly through Morthwaite. By noon, villagers gathered outside the cottage, their voices hushed but sharp, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. Some claimed they had always known something like this would happen. Others wept openly for the boy, whose strangeness had never erased the fact that he was one of their own. The father, once seen as a hard-working though harsh man, was now branded a murderer. The mother, once thought fragile and quiet, was seen in a new light, a figure of suffering who bore witness to an unthinkable act. The legal process in those days was swift and merciless. The constable was summoned from the nearest town, and the father was dragged from his home in irons. He shouted as they bound his wrists, insisting he had done what was right, that he had saved them all. His words echoed across the crowd, but no one answered. The villagers only stared, some in disgust, others in fearful silence, as though still uncertain whether the evil he spoke of was real. For the mother, the days that followed blurred into one long stretch of grief. She stayed with neighbors, her son's body taken for burial in the churchyard. But even there, whispers lingered. Some said the boy should not be laid to rest in consecrated ground, that his tongue had spoken blasphemy. Others pitied him, saying he had been innocent, caught between fear and misunderstanding. The priest stood firm, declaring that the boy was a child of God and deserved a Christian burial, silencing those who argued otherwise. The funeral was small, the snow falling heavy as the boy was lowered into the earth, his mother clutching the edge of the coffin until her fingers bled. The father faced trial soon after. The courtroom was crowded, villagers and strangers alike eager to see the man who had killed his own son. He stood pale and gaunt, his eyes darting, his words still frantic as he tried to explain himself. He spoke of the strange language, of nights when the boy whispered to shadows, of a force he swore had taken hold of the child. He said he had acted in desperation, that no one else could understand what it was like to live under the same roof with something so unholy. But his words fell flat. To the court, it was not a battle against evil, but a crime of rage. His reputation as a man quick to anger worked against him, each story of his temper painting a clearer picture of guilt. When the verdict came, it was swift. He was found guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. The villagers spoke of justice, though their voices carried unease. Some pitied him, saying fear had driven him mad. Others felt only relief that he would no longer walk among them. For the mother, the sentence brought no comfort. She had lost her son to her husband's violence and her husband to the gallows. She wandered the village like a ghost, her body present but her spirit broken. In the months that followed, the story of the boy spread beyond Morthwaite. Travelers carried whispers of the child who spoke a language no one knew, of the father who killed him, of the mother left behind. Some told it as a tale of caution, a warning of what fear can drive a man to do. Others spoke of the boy in hushed tones, wondering if his strange tongue had truly been a curse, if his death had silenced something that should never have been heard. For those in the village, the memory lingered like a scar. Mothers held their children tighter at night. Fathers who once scolded harshly softened their hands, afraid of repeating a mistake that could never be undone. Father Alden carried the weight of it heavily, his prayers longer, his sermons sharper, though in private he admitted to himself he still heard echoes of the boy's voice in the silence of the church. The mother remained in Morthwaite, though she was never the same. She lived in quiet solitude, her eyes always far away, her grief an open wound that the years never healed. The cottage where it happened stood empty for a long time. Some said it was cursed, that on certain nights, if the wind blew just right, you could hear the faint murmur of a child's voice speaking words that did not belong to this world. Others said it was only the wind in the chimney, the creak of old wood. But no one lingered near it after dark. Morthwaite returned to its rhythm, as small villages always do. But beneath its quiet surface, the story of the boy and the father lived on, a reminder of how quickly fear and suspicion can turn a home into a grave. The gallows stood at the edge of the town, stark against the pale winter sky. When the father was led there, bound and gaunt, the villagers gathered to watch. Some came out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity, but all carried the weight of the story that had unraveled in their midst. The execution was swift, without ceremony, his final words swallowed by the cold air. Some said he died, still insisting that he had done what was necessary, that he had fought evil itself. Others whispered he wept in his last moments, realizing too late what he had destroyed. Whatever the truth, his body swung in silence, a grim symbol of justice delivered, or vengeance disguised as law. For the mother, there was no relief in his death. She had lost both her child and her husband, though each in very different ways. Her grief consumed her, leaving her hollow and distant, a shadow of the woman she had once been. She remained in Morthwaite, but the village looked at her differently now. Some pitied her, treating her as a widow marked by tragedy. Others kept their distance, afraid that sorrow so heavy might be contagious. She lived quietly in the years that followed, her life reduced to tending small chores and walking daily to the churchyard, where she sat by her son's grave in silence. The village, too, carried the burden of what had happened. At first, there was outrage at the father's violence, at the senselessness of the crime. But as time passed, the story shifted. The boy who had spoken a language no one understood became a figure of legend. Some claimed his words had been a sign of prophecy, that his death had silenced something sacred. Others insisted it had been the devil's work, and the father had been both victim and villain, a man destroyed by fear. The truth blurred into myth, and the villagers passed the story to their children with hushed voices, shaping it into a cautionary tale that suited their beliefs. Father Alden never spoke publicly of what he had heard from the boy, but in PR, he carried it with him. He often lay awake in the rectory, hearing echoes of that strange language in his memory. He wondered if he had done enough, if he should have intervened sooner, if he had allowed fear and uncertainty to paralyze him when the family needed guidance. His sermons became sharper, more insistent on the dangers of temptation and the need for vigilance. Yet there was doubt in his eyes, a quiet uncertainty that never left him. Perhaps even he did not know whether the boy had been touched by something divine or cursed by something darker. The story reached beyond Morthwaite, carried by travelers and traders, each retelling shaping it differently. In some versions, the father was a righteous man who had struck down evil at great cost. In others, he was a brute who murdered an innocent child. The boy became either martyr or monster, angel or demon, depending on who told the tale. This shifting legacy spoke to the heart of the matter. People saw what they needed to see. They shaped the tragedy into a mirror of their own fears and beliefs. Was justice served? The father paid with his life, as the law demanded. The mother lived in grief, as fat. He demanded. The boy lay in the churchyard, silenced forever. But justice, if it existed at all in this story, was clouded by the complexity of what had driven the father to act. Fear had twisted into violence. Pride had curdled into rage. And society, quick to condemn, never paused to ask what it means to be confronted with something we cannot understand. Justice, in this case, was less about truth and more about closure, a way to seal the wound so the village could return to its rhythm. The tragedy revealed much about the fragility of human nature. The father was a man who could not bear uncertainty, who saw his authority and reputation slipping away and chose violence to reclaim control. The mother was torn between love and fear, powerless against the forces that consumed her family. The boy was caught in the middle, burdened with a gift or a curse that he himself likely did not understand. Each played their part, not out of malice, but out of desperation, fear, and the need to make sense of a world that often defies explanation. The case highlighted the dangers of power and pride, how a man's fear of being shamed by his neighbors could outweigh his duty as a father. It showed how communities, bound tightly by tradition and survival, can create pressure that drives people to unthinkable acts. It exposed how quickly compassion can turn to suspicion, how a child can be transformed into an object of dread simply for being different. At its core, the story of the boy who spoke a language that should not exist was less about the supernatural and more about human weakness. Fear of the unknown, pride and reputation, the crushing weight of judgment. These are forces that have shaped countless tragedies. The villagers sought to explain the boy's gift with superstition. The father sought to erase it with violence. The mother sought to love it despite her fear. And in the end, none succeeded. Years later, the cottage remained abandoned, its walls slowly crumbling into ruin. Travelers sometimes passed it on the road, noting the way the air seemed colder there, the silence heavier. Children dared each other to approach, whispering that if they listened closely at night, they could hear a boy's voice speaking in words that made no sense. Whether true or not, the story endured as a reminder of how one family's tragedy became a community's legend. What remains most haunting is not the mystery of the language, but the clarity of the crime. A father killed his son. A mother lost everything. A village bore witness. The rest, the strange words, the whispers of curses, the debates about evil and innocence, were only ways to soften the unbearable truth. At the heart of it was a simple, devastating fact. Fear destroyed a family. In the end, the tale of Morthwaite lingers because it asks questions that have no easy answers. How far will fear drive us? What do we do when faced with something we cannot understand? Where does justice lie? In punishment, in forgiveness, or in memory? The villagers moved on. The seasons turned, but the story still echoes, carried not just in whispers, but in the unease that settles whenever people recall the boy who spoke a language that should never have existed.